Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Marc Brackett. My day job is I am a professor at Yale University and the director of what's called the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. We're a team of 60 people who are scientists and practitioners who do research on emotions from preschoolers to CEOs. And then we do a lot of work in school systems. We have an approach called Ruler that's in about 3,500 schools across America and in other countries. And my other job, I guess I'll call it, is as someone who does a lot of public speaking on emotional intelligence. You might have saw if you came to the earlier keynote that I did with Ben Silverman from Pinterest. I wrote a book called Permission to Feel and have done quite a lot of public speaking about that. And in the corporate sector, companies like Amazon, where Rich is from, and Microsoft and others, and people have asked, well, like, all right, thank you for your hour-long presentation on emotional intelligence, like, what's the next steps? And I said, well, another 1-hour workshop. And so the reason why we're here today is to talk about the work that we have launched in businesses. And Andrea, I'm gonna have you introduce yourself.
Thank you. So yes, I'm a co-founder with Marc in a company called OG Life Lab. OG is the Italian word for today, which is the only day you can ever make a change, is the reason that has meaning.
But it's
It's
Italian.
spelled differently. Yeah, because if you actually saw the Italian word, you would say it Augie in our English parlance. So that didn't sound as nice. So yes, we became the way that Marc could get the Ruler model and the emotional intelligence work he's been hard at developing and researching for the last 20 years out to adults who want it and need it and needed some way to learn it when you're not in a school. How many days a year?
180.
Thank you. So if we've got 10 minutes a day over a period of time, we think that's a much better way to actually change your behavior and develop these kinds of skills. And so we've been working on that together and have a lot of different companies from all over the world that have taken us up on that proposition. So anyway, that's what I do. Came from a world of learning and development in corporate America and just really fell in love with being able to help people become what they want to be and really supporting that transformational process. And in my mind, emotional intelligence is foundational to that.
Thank you. And Rich.
All right, well, my name is Rich Hua, and it is incredibly exciting, and I'm honored to be here with my distinguished fellows here, Marc and Andrea. So I work at Amazon Web Services. I'm actually a global strategist and innovation evangelist for Amazon, and that's my day job. I'm actually here representing myself. What I say is not necessarily the opinion of Amazon, but the other thing I've done on the side is I've actually begun an emotional intelligence and success initiative at my company that has now affected almost 100,000 people. We've actually done trainings, seminars, workshops, and have a whole community of tens of thousands of people all across Amazon who are very excited about learning about emotional intelligence, practicing it, growing in their empathy, and becoming the best version of themselves, and hopefully helping our company do the same. So that's why I'm here. It's great to be here.
Cool, thanks, Rich. So one of the things I think that's unique about what we're going to talk about is that, as you saw, the subtitle is From Workshop to Systemic Change. As I said, my day job has been working in school systems across the world. New York City public schools, there's 500 schools that we work with. We have 450 schools in the state of Connecticut and elsewhere. And most people think of this work as, oh, the Yale guy's coming in to do a workshop on emotional intelligence. And then you do your workshop and everybody, they check the box. Like, okay, we've done the emotional intelligence training. It's like bullying prevention, right? Somebody comes in and talks about bullying or anti-racism or culture responsive pedagogy or whatever it is, and people think, I'm gonna check the box, we've done it. And as someone who has failed 25 years ago at doing that, I learned very early on in my career that really, if you wanna make any change, what I have found is you have to infuse the principles of emotional intelligence into the immune system. It's about how leaders lead, how teachers teach, how students learn, how families parent, and it's got to be integrated in the curriculum. It's got to be ongoing. I mean, how many of you, if you heard me speak earlier, have had a day during this pandemic where you're like, I can't deal with my feelings. Yeah. And so all of you are highly educated adults, from what I can gather. As am I. I wrote a book on this stuff. I've done 150 papers on this stuff, but yet here I was, sitting alone. My partner was away making a movie during COVID, sitting alone with my puppies. And I'm like, all right, I'm having a breakdown today. Like, I'm leading by myself. It's really weird. And so I tell you that because I think what both Andrea and Rich have done, and what we're all trying to do, is move away from that like train and hope model to thinking systemically. So Andrea, I want to start with you in terms of when we started building OG Life Lab, in terms of the modules and the program. Given your 20-something years in learning, what did you feel was like the model that would work the best?
Yeah, well, I could probably go on for 2 hours about that. I mean, because we're all very interested in education. But what we find is, how many of us have gone to a 2-day workshop that we thought, wow, that was really cool. I'm going to totally use this stuff. And then a week later, your binder's on the shelf gathering dust. And what you remember about that experience was how enjoyable it was, but you weren't really able to implement anything. And so, when we really looked at how do we make emotional intelligence scalable, how do we put it in the hands of as many people as possible, we had to kind of rethink the model. And so we created a way that you could come at it in little bits of time over a long period of time. Spaced repetition, of course, is something we think a lot about in education, especially for busy adults. And using this kind of spiral learning where you come back and address topics at a deeper level over time, we find actually helps people digest it better and try it out. And of course, we put it on a smartphone platform so that it's accessible any time of day. You can choose when you want to take the learning. There's live training that's a part of it, so that you get the best of an in-person or a live experience where insights can happen and other people ask questions you want to know the answers to. But a lot of it, especially around emotional intelligence, is so internal. Like, how am I feeling? What am I aware of? How do I make sense of this so that I can cope on those days where I'm overwhelmed? And so we found that this model of taking 16 hours of training and spreading it out 10 minutes a day over 60 or 90 days allows you to integrate that, practice it, skin your knees a little bit, and try again tomorrow so that you can see the benefit. And that's, really based on Albert Bandura's model of self-efficacy. That we have to see ourselves gain mastery and observe that in ourselves for us to have the confidence that we are changing in the way that we want to. And so we found a way to do that. And it's been really profoundly meaningful to see how what is great research lived out in lives during the pandemic.
Cool, thank you. So Rich and I met, we met, I don't remember how anymore. How did we meet?
I think through Andrea. I think she connected us, yeah.
It feels like, when you meet someone during the pandemic, you think you know them for 100 years, but you don't. And then, the first time we're meeting in person actually is here. But Rich, you work at a company with 1.3 million employees, and you're self-proclaimed chief emotional intelligence evangelist. Tell us more about how you're trying to get people, how are you getting people to be interested in this? Given that in my work with tech companies, oftentimes when there's a lot of engineers, without any offense to anyone who's an engineer, I love engineers. It just doesn't naturally, it's like the first thing you say is, I want to learn about my feelings.
Yeah, so I think it begins kind of my own story. I'm an engineer. So I immigrated to the United States when I was 3.5 years old from Taiwan. And ADHD, very socially maladjusted, had a really hard time building relationships. And so I experienced a lot of unpleasant feelings in the red and blue zones. And I decided to shut off my emotions. I thought, let me just focus on the intellectual part. And, as a good sort of Chinese person, studied really hard, studied engineering, and it was working great, right? Let me ignore my emotions, just try to be really good professionally. And then I did something that completely messed up my whole plan, and that was I got married. And my wife insisted on engaging me emotionally. And then I had children, and I thought, oh, wow. And then I actually, of all things, after studying engineering, became an evangelist for a church, and felt like maybe empathy would help me in my profession. So I thought all those things together should probably push me in that realm. And I discovered this whole realm that if you deal with your emotions, you wind up being a more productive, successful, and just kind and caring person, but it actually helps you professionally. So I made a pivot back into the tech world about 9 years ago, and I developed this program to help make people aware of the power of emotional intelligence. I brought it to Oracle, and then I started sharing it across Amazon. And one of the things that I've seen is that if you just share the data, it actually makes a huge difference. And I'll say things like, look, I know we're a super data-driven company. You're probably wondering, what does all this emotional, fluffy stuff have to do with anything? But then I'll share a lot of the data and the research, a lot of it yours, and it opens people's minds to at least thinking, this might actually have something to do with it. And like you do, asking questions like, do you think having anxiety, do you think being sad, do you think being optimistic affects your decision-making? And of course, at work, everyone wants to make good decisions. And so, I think of it as evangelism of the power of emotional intelligence, and I found that people are actually quite receptive if you help sort of take them where they're at and talk to them at their level. And being a fellow recovering engineer with low emotional intelligence, I think, I can definitely talk about that from experience.
Cool. By the way, I didn't want it to be that engineers have low emotional intelligence.
All good.
So one thing that I found, so in my 25 years running around the world trying to get school systems to adopt these practices, I'll give you an example. I show up in London, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, I'm like eager beaver to teach emotional intelligence, and within the first 30 minutes of my 9-hour day, an educator will stand up and say, it's not my job to talk about my feelings. And I sit there and I take a deep breath, and I think, I'm going to be here for a whole day doing training. Does anyone else feel any differently about this stuff? And then I just, in my course of years doing these trainings, and at my own university, doing a big training for surgeons, 100 surgeons in the room. I do my presentation. I think I'm a pretty darn good presenter. At the end of my talk, one of the leading famous surgeons stands up and he looks at me and he goes, "What happened to this university? We train Nobel laureates, not nice people." And I'm like, again, does anybody else feel any differently? And so my point here is that resistance, we've got big companies like Kohler and Amazon and Johnson & Johnson adopting these things. You're working with so many people. What are the barriers, and how do you deal with those barriers?
Yeah, I'll start, you finish. I think one of the barriers is getting the attention of senior leadership, of having a sponsor in your organization agree that the science and the data requires a change of course on behalf of employee well-being and on behalf of the successful execution of your organizational strategy. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to get some groundswell around that, because again, we pay attention to what our bosses are measuring us on. And unless there's some way that we're being measured and held accountable to growing these skills for all the reasons that they're important, it's really hard to get that initiative underway. So I would say getting executive sponsorship is a challenge, partially because what the research shows that the higher we go in an organization, the lower our empathy becomes. Yeah. The more insulated we become from other people's emotional realities. And when you're in the middle of an organization, you see the roller coaster, I think, a lot more readily than when you're high in the organization and people are funneling information to you that you want to hear. So I would say that's a big obstacle that can be overcome, I think, a lot of times when we share data and we talk and we show people how important this is. So what would you add to that? Yeah,
I think some really incredibly powerful things have happened in the world at a macro level over the past few years. I started delivering some talks, essentially trying to educate people on emotional intelligence. I think they were very well received, but it's like, oh, that's great. This could be helpful. But then what happened over the last year and a half at my company, and I think every company and organization, is the COVID pandemic. And what we actually were really good at was hiring amazingly high quality people, letting them do their thing. And a lot of times managers got away with, well, I don't really have to care about you. I hired a great person, go do your thing. I just have to kind of, do a little tweaking here and there. But with the COVID pandemic, suddenly all these managers realized, I actually have to care about your personal life. Like, you had all these really high performing people really struggling. And this idea of empathy, personal understanding, perspective taking, kindness and compassion suddenly became something that everyone was very interested in. And the other thing is, of course, the sweeping changes across America for inclusion and diversity and equity, where people, again, are realizing, wait, we need to bring our whole selves to work. We can't just ignore your background or your race or the fact you're from an underrepresented group. We need to care. How do we have these uncomfortable conversations, right? You don't just kind of bring it up at a team meeting, hey, we all feeling included here? Like, it's a difficult thing, and these are all emotional. And one thing I'm really proud of at Amazon is we have this idea of the day one mentality, which essentially means every day is the beginning. We're always growing, always evolving, always iterating. We can always do better. And so that, I think, mindset has really helped a lot of senior leaders at many levels embrace this idea of we can do better in terms of leadership, in terms of empathy, in terms of equity, in terms of inclusion. So much so that we actually just, with these famous leadership principles we operate by, about a month ago, we added 2 new ones, and one of them basically is strive to be Earth's best employer, and one of the best phrases I love is lead with empathy, right? Really talking about that as an explicit thing. That squarely falls in the realm of emotional intelligence. So I think it's kind of a right time and a right place, and these macro things. So aligning what you're doing with the goals of the organization has been huge. It became something that was nice to something that is really at a macro level very, very important to, all of Amazon. So I think that's been great.
I think one of the spectacular things and why Rich shines as an example for us all is that he's not in a position where he's deploying emotional intelligence as a senior leader. He's been an influencer in his organization with no stated authority over this domain, but because it's interested him, the data bears it out. He's been in basically inserted himself in a variety of ways to share it across many audiences within Amazon, and as a result, has really spread the word to thousands and thousands of people. So I want to give you props for that and for you to talk about it a little bit more, because I think for many of the clients that we work with, we end up talking with people who feel like, I know it's important, I know it's critical, I've seen the data and the research, I'm trying to convince other people, but I have no power. And here's an example of where when we live these principles ourselves and we share it with others, we start a ripple effect that has far-reaching positive consequences. So would you share a little bit about how it got started for you and how you continue to grow that influence in your organization?
I thought I was the moderator.
I had to go there.
I was born alone, I'll sit here alone. I'm just kidding.
I have a question for you.
All right.
Yeah, so happy to do that. So I think of a few concepts, right? One is you got to be willing to take risks, right? Put yourself out there. We have an annual conference called Sales Kickoff at AWS, and I basically, we talk about technology and all sorts of, technologically oriented stuff, and I put in emotional intelligence as a topic, and I thought, hey, maybe they'll accept it. I took a risk, and somebody decided this is might be helpful. And so they stuck me in sort of a small room, said, 185 people fit in there, maybe somebody will come. Well, what happened was the day before I gave the talk, so many people tapped on wanting to attend the session, they moved to a bigger room. They said, we got to put you in a room for 1,000 people because so many people want to show up for it. And it was standing room only. So that told me people are really interested in this. They want to hear about this topic. We've got so many great things. This is something that we don't necessarily have being talked about. And so that was kind of the launching pad. And it wound up getting the highest ratings at the whole conference, and more people started hearing about it. What happened was people started coming up and saying, how can I help you with this? This is amazing. This is great. I want to be involved. And so we formed what I call the EQ Champions, right? And they're now a team of hundreds of volunteers all across Amazon who are passionate about practicing, growing in, and sharing emotional intelligence skills because they really believe it. And they gave me all these ideas. Like everything I've done pretty much is they've given me these great ideas. Hey, you should talk to this person. Hey, you should present over here. Hey, you should start a Slack channel. Hey, let's create a wiki. And one of the most beautiful things was starting a mailing list within Amazon that now tens of thousands of people, every day they get an email that's about emotional intelligence. And so they might attend a seminar or workshop, but it's really kind of a funnel to getting the email. So now every day they basically get a nudge. Hey, look at this. Hey, think about that. Here's a way to be more aware. Here's a way to be more compassionate. Here's a way to be more productive. Here's a way to better manage stress. And so a lot of people have said this is literally out of the hundreds of emails they get every day, their favorite one. One person actually said, this is the best perk of working at Amazon. It's not even a perk. It's like you sending out daily emails. And so having a curated, valuable set of things has made a difference. And so I have vice presidents and senior leaders who are all part of this email list, and so they all love it. And they ask for more and more of that content in the days to come. So now 100,000 people later, that's basically what's happened and what continues to grow. So I'd say everyone has a sphere of influence, and if we leverage it, it'll expand, and you'll find other people who are interested and want to build that groundswell of support for something.
One thing that I'm thinking about right now is that I bet if I asked every one of you what is emotional intelligence, you would have a different definition. And I think part of the challenge is when I've done the corporate presentations, I'm having all these flashback memories of this Fortune 100 company. I'm in the top C-suite, and this one CEO looks at me and he goes, "Look at my office. Do you think I need this training?" And I said, "Well, I've talked to some of the people who work for you." And he goes, "I'm going to tell you what emotional intelligence is." I'm like, "Okay, it's only my career." He goes, "It's charisma." And I was like, I hate to tell you this, but like in any of the theoretical articles or empirical articles that we've written, charisma doesn't come up as, that's a trait, right? It's a personality trait. And so just to put this like into perspective, so everyone here knows at least what we're talking about, emotional intelligence has to do with how we reason with and about our feelings. It's not motivation. It's not extroversion. It's not grit. It's not even empathy, actually. Empathy is a component of it, but it's broader than empathy, because you may be empathic, but you may not know what to do with the empathy. Or you may have overzealous empathy and get lost in it. So we talk about emotional intelligence as a set of discrete skills that have to do with being really keen and perceptive of emotion, reasoning with, understanding that anger is about injustice and disappointment is about unmet expectations. And there's a difference between anxiety and fear. That if you think everyone is stressed, but they're actually feeling anxiety about uncertainty versus impending danger, how you support them would be very different. So having that language, the rules around expressing emotion, we know there are rules in our society around emotion expression. There's cultural rules, there are familial rules, there are rules around power and race in our society. Does everyone have the ability to express anger the same way in our society? The answer is absolutely not. And so that makes you think that, well, this is a skill that's not only about an individual, but it's about at a societal level. And then the strategies to regulate. And I share that because, and the research that we do, and this is what I'm going to try to get your responses to this. So hot off the press, not published yet, I'm going to get in trouble by my research team for sharing this, is we did a study, multiple studies, looking at the leaders in terms of their intrapersonal emotional intelligence. Like how skilled are you at dealing with your own emotional life? And then how skilled are you at dealing with other people's emotions? Because there's differences, right? It's like clinical psychologists. They're all great with their patients, but they're a mess personally. I'm just telling you this from having lived and worked with many of them. And so what we found was that pre-pandemic, the interpersonal aspects, like my manager is really good at helping me feel less anxious or feel less burnt out or can comfort me when there's a problem, were really important. But during the pandemic, what we found was that not only it was the added value of the intrapersonal aspects of emotional intelligence, like I want to see my leader is capable of dealing with all this uncertainty, all this stress themselves. And I'm just curious, does that resonate with you? What do you see in the most effective leaders that you've worked with, Andrea and Rich?
Yeah, sure. That's actually an excellent question, because one of the things that I think in a lot of companies, and ours included, is that you tend to have this separation between your professional life and your personal life. And so you're able to kind of compartmentalize it. And what happened with the pandemic was it all got mashed together, right? As some people have jokingly said, no one was working from home, they're all living at work, right? Because it kind of became this mishmash. And one of the most powerful things that I saw some incredible managers do was basically be vulnerable, right? They would share about their own challenges, but then how their strategies to deal with it. I'm stressed out. I'm trying to homeschool 3 kids and also manage a large team and still perform at a high level. Like there are all these things where I'm worried about my grandparents or my parents, all these things. And so vulnerability was really quite powerful for people to see that their leaders were going through the same thing, but also understood where they're coming from. So I'd say that actually was a really, really powerful thing. And for the ones who didn't share or didn't talk about things or didn't acknowledge those things, that became a real problem. And so to a lot of people's credit, I think a lot of managers realized I have to grow in these skills in a way that I didn't think before. I've gotten this far with the skills I have, but it's not enough for this new situation that I'm in.
Rich, one thing that you're reminding me of is the fact that in our work with schools, like teachers believe they have to tell their kids that they're happy every single day. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Brackett is great today. It's like September. It's like November. Mr. Brackett is feeling elated. It's December. Mr. Brackett is fantastic. It's January. And basically, this educator has never demonstrated that he or she experiences other emotions. And so kids start lying to their teachers about how they're feeling. Or they don't tell them. They just say, I'm great, I'm happy, when they're maybe suffering on the inside. And so, Andrea, I'm just thinking, in terms of the stories that you have of all the clients that you've worked with, are people feeling more comfortable being authentic and honest? And give us an example.
Yeah, well, and I would just to piggyback on what Rich was saying, it's people want to they want to be shown the way. Like, you're telling me how to move forward in my career, and I need to be shown the way of how to navigate this too. So when and so I've worked with some leaders who say, when I would say, as a consultant to you, you need to ask your employees how they're doing. And they would say, well, how do I do that? Okay, we're starting at square one, really. And so, sometimes the advice and the guidance needs to be quite simple. Is you can ask them these 3 questions, and it will make a difference. And it did make a big difference. So, but there's a lot of times. Oh, there you go.
There you go.
My microphone.
Hold it more like that.
Is it dying?
There you go.
There you go. I didn't think it was me.
No, but it works better that way anyway.
Okay. Anyway, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sensei. One example comes to mind of this gentleman who I worked with who runs compensation strategy for this very large multinational insurance company. So his job once a quarter is to provide compensation guidance to the executive committee. And so he would come to the executive committee pre-COVID and give his presentation and just get peppered by the executives and just shot down every idea, every question. It made him very defensive. And it came across in his presentation. And to the point that after the meeting, he would hear from his boss that these executives had gone to his boss to say, are you sure this guy is competent at his job? Which would make him feel even worse, right? So every quarter, he's even more defensive. And so he's going through this program and learning about how his emotions are impacting him. And he thought, well, if I can be more proactive about knowing how I normally feel, and I could actually choose the way I want to feel, and then I could actually choose some strategies that would help me stay there, maybe the meeting would go differently. And so he started the night before. He started role-playing the kinds of questions that he would get in this next meeting, which, by the way, marked the change of an economy and required big changes to their compensation strategy, which always goes over like a lead balloon. So anyway, he's prepared, what could he say in response to these questions he'll get? Because his goal was to stay calm and centered and not get triggered into the red quadrant. And so as he's doing that, he shows up in the meeting, he makes sure he's properly caffeinated beforehand, had the right amount of energy, had a good night of sleep, all the things that we can do to really up our level of presence in that kind of situation. And he starts his presentation, And as per usual, he gets the questions. But instead, he just takes a breath and he says things like, I could totally understand why you would ask me that. Let me tell you what the research I found bears out. And he said about halfway through the meeting, you could feel the entire tenor of the room shift. And it was no longer a me versus them, it was an us and a we. And at the end of his presentation, they accepted his recommendation with no challenge. And he's like, that never happened before. And he's like, what really struck me about that situation was no one else changed. Like, they were the same executives that showed up with the same questions and the same aggressive way of asking them, but it was me that did the work and I showed up differently. And as a result, I not only stayed better in my own center of well-being, but I got a better outcome from my organization. And I think that's the power of emotional intelligence, is that when we do a little of this work on ourselves, the ripple effects, again, across the organization are almost uncountable, because the ability to actually have an outcome like that has a real tangible impact because of emotional intelligence, I think happens a lot more than we know.
Interesting. So another thing, at least that I have found, is that people say things like, I don't have time for this, or how much time is this going to take? I'll give you one example. I hired someone from the business world to run our center, and after he worked in on Wall Street, and then he started working at the Center for Emotional Intelligence, and then he's like, Marc, how much time do I have to dedicate to feelings every day? Like, I'm not used to this. I used to just pay people more money and then they just go away, and like this is hard. Like. And firstly, how much do I have to listen to everybody's feelings, and do I have to ask them how they're feeling, and then what do I say when they tell me how they're feeling? And so I know that you guys we've done a pilot with you, Rich, and I know you were saying earlier when we were chatting that like the modules are like 5 to 10 minutes, but some people are saying like, that's a long module. And so I'm like, how are you dealing with that resistance?
Yeah.
Like, how are you getting people to like commit to the work?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I think about is what motivates people. Like, a big thing with like the EQ champions and our thousands of other people that are part of the community is I ask them, really think about what you want to improve in your life, in your marriage, in your family, in your job as a leader, and really have that as the driver, right? To actually put in the effort to change these things, because emotional intelligence is such an incredible foundation for all the things you've been basically have been holding you back. Like, I know so many engineers who are super smart, best in their field, incredible coders, incredible but they just feel stuck, right? They've not been promoted, or they can't seem to get along with colleagues, they can't influence other people. And just considering how this can really improve your life has made, I think, a huge difference. I mean, I think one of the incredible things that I've heard people talk about after talking more about emotional intelligence and sort of opening their eyes, and people have come and said, hey, my wife wants to thank you for what you just taught me. She's been telling me for 30 years that I don't listen, and I finally heard it from you, and I decided to try some techniques, and they made a big difference. And they would say, it's helped my marriage, or it's helped me with my teenage kids. Or, these emails that you've been sending out during the pandemic have literally been the thread of hope I've had during these stressful pandemic times. And so really finding that inner motivation, I think, is really key, right? And then that's the personal part, but then again, aligning it with the corporate goals, right? I mean, for us at Amazon, we now have this new leadership principle of strive to be Earth's best employer, lead with empathy, have fun at work. And everyone's going, well, how are we going to do that? So a lot of what we're talking about is going to absolutely help accrue to that result.
Nice. So while we have about 5 minutes left, I'm wondering, people might want to ask their own questions. Is there anything on anyone's mind, or any particular question you have about the concept of emotional intelligence? How do you build a company that teaches emotional intelligence in a sustainable way? How do you implement emotional intelligence training? Anything on anyone's mind? Yes. Yeah.
What is it that we can do right from our start? Like, where do we begin, and how do we make, especially middle school and high school? I know elementary school students
Yeah.
are more adept at it, and when we start losing that connection because we all grow.
So really good question, and I appreciate that. Yeah, the question is, I'm 50. That's what I am, and like I never heard of this thing
You look
before.
good for 50, though, Marc.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's the makeup they put on me earlier. Like, can I still learn this stuff? Very briefly, I think the most important thing to know about this work is that none of us are born with these skills. We're born with a temperament. Like, I was born neurotic. I worry about everything, and I worry about why I worry, and and growing up with a neurotic family, I worry more than I ever wanted to worry. But that's my genetics. I'm introverted. I'm not extroverted. You can move that a little bit, but not a lot. But none of us grew up with an emotion vocabulary. Like, I didn't have language to describe. I had to learn the language. I was in therapy a lot in my life, and I learned a lot about my relationship with my mother, but I never learned strategies to regulate, like specific evidence-based emotion management strategies to deal with anger or disappointment or frustration. So I think the good news is that once you expose people to this information, if they're open to it, learning can happen. My father at 78, very briefly, he was having a meltdown with his wife at the time, and he was saying he was angry. I actually helped him identify that he was jealous of her grandchildren, and all of a sudden he had an epiphany that he had to regulate his jealousy, not his anger. I'm curious for all of you in terms of, you must get that, like, I'm a 70-year-old doctor, like, why am I going through this training? And
Yeah, well, and I would just say an ancillary question to your question is, well, who is this emotional intelligence for anyway? Like, is it for managers or is it for doctors? And we have yet to meet a profession or a person that couldn't take advantage of these skills in their own life, for their personal lives and their professionals across the board. And we've had doctors tell us amazing stories, and cement masons that have told us it's changed their lives, and all in between. So blue collar, white collar, deskless worker, like all the things. We all could use a little bit more of emotion vocabulary and regulation strategies to help us through our lives.
Briefly, how many of you feel like you've had an emotion education, like a solid education in emotion growing up in your household or in your school?
Negative or positive?
She asked negative or positive.
Yeah, that's over drinks.
Okay.
But okay, so Rich, did you want to say something?
Yeah, we're a very data-driven company, and a lot of people ask, hey, what's all this emotional, fluffy stuff have to do with anything? And I say, emotions are data, and they're actually really, really important data points. And so it's basically just saying, I'm going to now start taking that into account in all the things I do, instead of ignoring it as if it doesn't exist, even though we have emotions 90+% of our day, or just, embracing it and then, crying all the time. It's neither of those. It's basically saying, here's some important data points. I'm going to start accessing those, the mood meter is one idea, to be able to just start leveraging those to make better decisions. And I've talked to, tens of thousands of people of all ages. And one thing I can say, it's never too late. Doesn't matter how old you are, it's just the attitude you have. These are skills that we can pick up at any age, actually.
So last question I'll give to this gentleman here, because I met you at dinner, and you get biased. It's a biased...
So a lot of what you talked about is kind of personal responsibility and self-awareness.
Yep.
What do others play, and what tools do you provide to potentially express what others need to in order to kind of be healthy in this space?
Yeah, great question. We have 15 seconds left, so let's take it outside. Happy to answer that outside, but I'll just say one thing. We grossly underestimate co-regulation, that we are not working in vacuums. We are working in communities, and everyone needs these skills. And I want to thank Andrea. Do you want to just share how people can get information?
Yeah, by the way, if you're interested in trying our program, you can email us at support@oglifelab.com. And if you mention this conference, then we'll give you $50 off the program if you want to try it out. So just a way to kind of get in there and work on it.
Last word, Rich, quickly.
You know what? We can all make a difference. If we start with ourselves, you can make a bigger difference than you ever imagined. Just be bold and try. And I think, everything big starts with something small.
Cheers to the emotion revolution. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.